Good morning. Today we come to our second reflection on the Psalms, and we're going to look at two very short passages that follow on from each other in Mark's Gospel. We begin at chapter 4, verse 26. He also said, "This is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself the soil produces grain, first the stalk, then the head, and then the full kernel in the head. And as soon as the grain is ripe, he puts a sickle to it, because the harvest has come." And again he said, "What shall we say the kingdom of God is like? Or what parable shall we use to describe it? It is like a mustard seed, which is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all the garden plants, with such big branches that birds can perch in its shade." With many similar parables, Jesus spoke words to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable, but when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, today's readings occur in the context of a series of parables where we find Jesus teaching the crowds and then taking his disciples away later to deepen their understanding of what he'd taught. He wanted them to understand the nature of God's love for his people, God's desires for his love to be alive and active in the world. This particular parable only occurs in the book of Mark, and it reveals spiritual growth to be a continuous and gradual process, which we as modern day disciples are involved in. As I sat contemplating this particular reflection, I became aware of a rather large sunflower in my garden. You may be able to see it over my shoulder. It was a gift to me from a friend, and it was given to me as a tiny little shoot with just 2 leaves. And it's grown to this monster that you can see. I don't know how it's grown. I don't have green fingers. All I did was put it in a bigger pot, pop it in a sheltered, sunny corner, and water it periodically. God provided the growth, and I'm getting the joy from it. And now it has this huge yellow bloom full of black seeds that the birds will enjoy. And somehow this sunflower speaks to me of the particular parable that we've heard this morning. I certainly don't have green fingers, but God himself has given it growth. And isn't it a fabulous illustration of how our faith can grow from something very small to something fairly monumental? If we move from that sunflower to the parable of the mustard seed, I wonder how you and I, as modern day disciples, might draw encouragement from this story. Putting it simply, I would suggest in its encouragement to look for growth from small beginnings, to acknowledge that when we reach out in faith to do things from God, it won't necessarily grow all at once. It may take a considerable time for things to grow into something successful and lasting. And God is perhaps saying, don't be discouraged, but hang in there, keep trying, and I will water that seed that you've planted. You know, we can all have a hand in the growth of God's kingdom. We can all plant small seeds of friendship, generous acts of compassion and love to friends and to strangers alike. And I believe, if nothing else, this past year or so have helped us to become aware of how strangers have pulled together to become neighbours, how strangers have helped each other to become friends. Our church buildings may have been closed, but I'm sure that our church bodies haven't been dormant. In fact, through reaching out through modern means like computers, we've been able to touch new generations of people who maybe haven't the courage to set foot over the door of a church, but have wanted something, have desired something to hang on to. And in being able to access faith or the seeds of faith without putting themselves in a vulnerable place, maybe that churches have been able to plant some seeds that will grow into full-grown faith journeys. We can only trust God for the growth. As we study the words and the works of Jesus, of God the Father, he will continue to scatter the seeds of truth in our hearts. And as we meet with other Christians, as we read our Bible and pray, as we perhaps watch reflections on the screen, God himself will feed our faith. He will encourage us. He will guide us. He will correct us sometimes, but he will always be there. You know, Jesus once said, "My Father is the gardener." And God himself is challenging us to be willing to become fertile ground in which growth might occur. I'm convinced that God uses the most unlikely people and the most unlikely events to grow his kingdom and to meet his purposes of sharing his love in action so that others may find shelter and safety in his care. I'd like to share with you now the story of a small church congregation that I know. The members there have for many years contributed to Food Bank, little by little, week by week, bringing 1 tin or 3 tins or packet of pasta, whatever. But faithfully, they've helped to feed others through the Food Bank. However, a few members of that congregation have got more involved. They've taken the collections and taken it to the Food Bank. They've helped sort the food. They've helped distribute the food. They've put themselves in a place of vulnerability where they've met strangers and had conversations, and in doing so have acted rather like the Good Samaritan of our last parable. They've acted in love and compassion, reaching out their hand, never knowing whether they're going to get a friendly greeting. Now, the pandemic created huge issues for the Food Bank there because the traditional sources of supply, the churches, the local supermarkets, people simply weren't going. And so the food supplies collapsed. So 2 or 3 members of that church decided, well, we'll leaflet our locality, the streets we live in, 2 or 3 streets around, and we'll offer to collect cans and dried goods to go to the Food Bank, and we'll undertake to get it there. They had a very surprising reaction. I was speaking to one of them just a few days ago, and I was told that, in fact, there are days when he gets home and he finds 6 bags of groceries just plonked behind his car, ready to go to Food Bank. Or people give him cheques and he can pass them on. These people got together then with a local public house who were concerned about their community. They're very community minded. And they'd set up tables in their car park, because obviously they were closed, where food could be donated to be passed out to people in need. They didn't need a reference. They didn't need anybody to authorise it. They wanted to do something and they did it. So these church members got together with them and helped to man. Well, they called it the community table. Now, following the example of people like Marcus Rashford, they became aware that there was a very great need in the community, that those who perhaps were on free school meals wouldn't get their hot meals in the holidays or might not get fed at all. So they got together and they decided that they would put themselves out there. They would reach out in compassion and start to provide meals at lunchtimes for adults and children in need. So they've undertaken through the summer holidays to provide food. Where's the food going to come from? Well, they've got into contact with local supermarkets who've started to donate what's left over at the end of the day. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, bread, that kind of thing. And they're working with the Food Bank too. The church has undertaken to offer the church hall and the kitchen facilities, but also they've undertaken to help provide people who will make the food and tend to the tables and so on. It will be not just church people, it will be people from the community. They've also undertaken that there will be people there every day who will just sit and be available if someone needs a listening ear, a safe space because they're feeling vulnerable. Little roots, big growth. They don't know how successful this project will be, but they've undertaken in faith to do it, and I have the greatest respect for them. I would ask that you would pray for them, remember them in your prayers, that they may be able to reach those people who need a meal. I think for me, this is a huge example of small seeds and big growth, offering shelter and God's love into the community. The growth of God's kingdom is dependent on many small acts of love and faithful service. Let's never doubt that the kingdom work is living and active today. And we thank God for the men and women of courage who will risk failure, who will risk rejection, but who are determined to make a difference. simply because they love and they serve in God's name. I wonder, do you and I have the courage to try and make a difference? Do you and I have the courage to risk rejection? What are we going to do to plant a seed of love today?